reading this morning is from a book called Mindfulness in Plain English by the Venerable Henepola Gunaratana, a Buddhist text, if you didn't get that. So what is this happiness? For most of us, the perfect happiness would mean getting everything we wanted, being in control of everything, playing Caesar, making the whole world dance a jig according to our every whim. Once again, it does not work that way. Take a look at the people in history who have actually held this type of power. They were not happy people. Most assuredly, they were not at peace with themselves. Why? Because they were driven to control the world totally and absolutely, and they could not. They wanted to control all men, and yet there remained men who refused to be controlled. They could not control the stars. They still got sick. They still had to die. Gross national happiness. We return this morning to the basic subject of happiness, on which I preached from this pulpit many times. I find it fascinating how we conceive of happiness, what we will do to achieve it, how we convince ourselves we don't have it, what we think we're lacking, and so forth. It's a state of mind, a feeling, but it's also a concept, and we suspect it has something to do with the actual objective conditions in the world, but we're not sure just how. So I was intrigued a couple of months ago to hear of a country that takes the happiness of its citizens so seriously that it tries to measure it and to make public decisions according to the test of what will increase the general happiness. The people telling me about this were Michael and Ann Westgate, friends and neighbors of ours whom Jacqueline and I had invited for a much delayed dinner. The country is Bhutan. You may be forgiven if you're a little hazy on where it is. Like Nepal, it straddles the border between India and Tibet. But where Tibet is controlled by communist China and India is a democracy, Bhutan is a kingdom, a Buddhist kingdom. That's right, a kingdom with a real king. Now, economists for a long time have used a concept called the gross national product, or GNP, to measure the value of all goods and services produced in a year in one country. They use this as an indicator of health and economic strength. At some point in the 1980s, most countries went to a slightly different index called the gross domestic product. The differences need not concern us here. But by then, the king of Bhutan had already decided that the most important statistic in that kingdom would be gross national happiness. Believe it or not, the Bhutanese government collects data and measures gross national happiness every year, and moreover, makes policy decisions as to what will increase GNH. In part, this is possible because Bhutan is a Buddhist country. I've talked before about how the Buddhist view of happiness differs from the mainstream American view. Our Declaration of Independence enshrines the pursuit of happiness as one of the inalienable rights, which is self-evident, a noble idea. But in practice in American life, the pursuit of happiness has often amounted to the purchase of happiness for those who can afford it. The consumer culture is founded on materialism, the promise that the key to happiness is the right car, the right job, the right home, or even the right toothpaste. The hamster wheel in which we run has us divided between the misery of not ever having enough of the goods of the so-called good life and realizing that the ones we do have are not giving us the happiness we expected. My Buddhism professor in divinity school was fond of quoting Woody Allen. Life is like airline food. It's disappointing, and there's not enough of it. The way off the hamster wheel is offered by the Buddha's four noble truths. First, that everything is dukkha, which can be translated as suffering, but can also be translated as unsatisfactoriness. Second, that the root of unsatisfactoriness is craving and clinging to that which is by nature impermanent. Third, that the release from dukkha is through overcoming craving and clinging. And fourth, that the way to overcome craving and clinging is through the Eightfold Path of Buddhist discipline. In other words, unhappiness is not principally in the world out there, but in our own minds, which, if we can learn to discipline them, will offer us a deeper and more permanent happiness than we can ever get through chasing after the ultimate car, job, or toothpaste. Thich Nhat Hanh said, people asked the Buddha how to be happy, and he said that all the Buddhas teach the same thing. Refrain from doing bad things, try to do good things, and learn to subdue, purify your mind. That is the teaching of all Buddhas. The first two of these precepts are perhaps obvious prescriptions for virtue, and many of us would agree that virtue can lead to happiness. But the third precept is the key. Learn to subdue and purify your own mind. Your own happiness is not due to your luck, your fate, your position in society, but is primarily due to your mental outlook on these factors. Now, this is a vast oversimplification, a cartoon drawing of the difference between a Buddhist and a materialistic outlook on happiness. But it is enough to frame a discussion I hope we can have this morning about how a government can take national happiness seriously. In the 40 years since Bhutan started taking happiness seriously, other governments have started to take a look at it. In July of 2011, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution which invited member states, quote, to pursue the elaboration of additional measures that better capture the importance of the pursuit of happiness and well-being in development with a view to guiding their public policies, unquote. The United Nations. In a way, the term happiness is misleading here. Happiness can be a transitory emotion, what you feel when your team wins the Super Bowl, or you just got a promotion, or if you've just heard a great piece of music. We can't realistically plan for that kind of happiness in the policy choices we make in the public realm. The kind of happiness which can form the basis of societal decisions is the longer-term happiness which also goes by the name of satisfaction or well-being. So, now let me turn you over to my friend and neighbor, Michael Westgate, who has actually been to Bhutan and can tell us how it's working. Michael is uniquely qualified to make this report, for he is the rare Harvard MBA who has devoted his life to the public good, turning slums into livable neighborhoods and becoming an expert in the finances of community development. After Michael gives us his perspective, we want to open the floor up to comments from you all.
Thank you, Edmund. One minor correction. The book that Anne wrote is pronounced Shamai, and it's the Yupik Eskimo word for shalom. Bhutan's a beautiful country, about the size of Vermont and half of New Hampshire, bounded by Tibet, which is now part of China to the north, India to the east, south, and west. It's defined by the Himalayan mountains. It's a deeply Buddhist country of about 800,000 people. You might ask, how can a country ranks among the lowest in the world in per capita cash income, about $110 a month, ranks among the highest in terms of happiness or well-being, 8th in the world according to Business Week, and I don't want to quantify rankings of countries. I don't think there's a serious way that you can compare a largely non-cash rural country with, say, a Scandinavian country that has many of the things that we think of as contributing to well-being. And well-being really is the better translation of the term, and dekid is the Bhutanese word, and it was actually coined by the last king, King Jigme Singye Wangchuck, in the 1970s. Fourth king, as he is known, set out to have goals and measure progress using other than financial yardsticks. The king is said to have used GNH as a pun on GDP. But GNH is enshrined in their constitution, Article 9, the state shall strive to promote those conditions that will enable the pursuit of GNH. Actually, not that far from what's in our Constitution. The end result, according to Article 11, of all development activities should be the attainment of GNH. Good and transparent governance is embedded in their Constitution, including avoidance of conflict of interest. In addition to the states that Edmund mentioned, 3 U.S. states, Vermont, Maryland, and Oregon, have adapted GNH in one form or another. I think it's important to recognize that single numberitis, it's easy to measure GDP, and in some ways it serves as a proxy that the nation as a whole is getting more money, but where that money is going and where it's and how it's being spent and who benefits and who doesn't benefit are really better measured by some of the other items that I'll mention. When Ann and I visited Bhutan for 2 weeks in April of 2014 through Road Scholar, previously Alder Hostel, we were accompanied by a superb guide, Finn Norbu and Tandon, the driver herder. The roads in Bhutan average about 1.5 lanes wide. You go about 3 miles on curvy roads for every 1 mile that you could walk, which is why they still have trails that many people use by foot. Tandon never showed any anger on the road when one trucker cut us off at a curve, and he's a devout Buddhist like 90% of the country. Tandon believes in many future lives, and he simply said, that man will come back as an ant. It helps to have a long-term perspective on things. Finn arranged a morning with the deputy head of the Office of GNH, who described how they use metrics for every proposal coming before the government. There are actually 9 domains, which interestingly are given equal weight. Well, that was one of the things that surprised me. It includes health as one, in physical health, but equal weight psychological health, the mental health of individuals and of communities. It includes cultural diversity and resilience. Healthcare is free for everybody. You have a choice when you walk into a medical facility. You turn right for Western medicine and you turn left for traditional healing. Education is also free to all. It's conducted in English, which surprised us, except for language lessons in their native Dzongkha. Dzongkha means literally the language of the Dzongs. Historically, every district has been governed by a fortress that is half monastery, half civil governance. And you cannot disentangle the Buddhist from the governance. Environmental concerns include ecological diversity and resilience, as well as clean air, obviously, clean water, forests, which comprise 2/3 of the country and will remain so under their constitution. Spiritual and historical values are to be preserved. All houses must be built according to traditional design. Living standards, and here again, this is just one of the 9. Living standards are not just wages and wealth, which in rural areas are likely to be in kind as much as they are in cash. You may see 9 or 10 cords of firewood. You may see 500 pounds of rice. There's a lot of ways of measuring wealth other than what's in your bank account. Optimal time is defined as enabling people on average to have 8 hours a day for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours for activities of their choice, whether it's paid work or unpaid work on the farm or in the house. Government and corporate wages are expected to be distributed equitably. They score programs and projects on a long list of desirable attributes. One component which differs from ours is employment. Where Western countries might seek to maximize efficiency on a project by employing as few people as possible, Bhutan scores employment as maximizing the number of people who can appropriately be employed on a project. So you don't bring in a huge machine at huge cost. If for comparable or perhaps even higher cost, you can hire 100 or 200 people perhaps doing work by hand. People are surveyed before and after a project is complete to see how their life has changed. The government's main goal is not to prevent change, that they acknowledge change will happen, but to control the speed of change and to try to improve the quality of life in the process of change. The country does have its problems. Education is largely limited to elementary school. Large numbers of young people are moving into the capital city. Drugs and alcohol exist there as they do here. Bhutan has a lot of advantages in implementing GNH. Its small size, isolated borders which allow it to control the numbers of visitors and immigrants, its great natural beauty and serenity, its abundant hydroelectric power, its largely devout Buddhist population, and I think a key is its wise hereditary leadership, which has been now in its 5th generation. They've been truly blessed with a series of father to son kings since about 1902. What impressed me the most about Bhutan's approach, I'd like to quote here from the First Lady of Oregon for the past 4 years, Sylvia Hayes. What impressed me the most about Bhutan's approach is that they are one of the very first nations to go beyond GDP by applying the comprehensive metrics of the Gross National Happiness Index to guide policy, budget, and infrastructure decisions. I think the GNH Center is incredibly important to the world as we've reached the point of diminishing returns on a limitless growth economic model on a planet of finite resources. What can we learn from GNH? To assess programs and projects on a more complex matrix than maximizing income or minimizing costs just on the basis of price. To value traditions, to weigh the importance of the environment as part of economic development, to see that all people and all communities have a right to well-being as a national goal. Thank you.
As we move to your reactions and input, I want to suggest 3 rubrics under which we could look at this, all of which begin with you. First, utilitarianism. The idea that everything should be managed so as to provide the greatest good for the greatest number. That's a practical philosophy. Does this approach to government look like it would maximize the public good? The second is utopianism. After Thomas More's book in the 16th century about a fantasy island which had the best government imaginable, and which inspired lots of utopian experiments down through the centuries since, including Brook Farm, Fruitlands, and Hopedale here in Massachusetts. Utopian communities have a way of falling apart within a short time. We just celebrated Pi Day. Is gross national happiness pie in the sky? Is this an attempt to set up perfection? And if so, is it doomed for failure? And the third view is universalism. For our original theologian, Hosea Ballou, founded his faith on the proposition that it was God's purpose to happify people. When you realize that all people are saved and there is no hell, it can't help but make you deeply happy. And maybe being in a country whose leaders take happiness seriously could do as much. So who wants to respond? I'd like Jan to pass around the mic since I'm having a little cold and don't want to have too much contact with folks. But raise your hands and she'll bring them around, and Michael and I will stand at the pulpit and respond to you.
Marion Harcourt. I think it would be interesting if our president had, as part of his cabinet, a Department of Happiness. I wonder how that would affect. Part of the cabinet, a very important position.
And who would be the Secretary of Happiness?
I'll just respond briefly. They've taken this very seriously for several decades. actually for even longer. I was surprised to find a reference back to 1729, when in one of the earliest documents in Bhutan in forming an alliance among the then heads of the different districts, they said, what is the purpose of government if it's not to enhance people's happiness? So I think it's a good idea. It's tempting to try to think what you might do on a more local scale. You know, perhaps Massachusetts could be a leader, along with Vermont, Oregon, and Maryland.
Still admirable. How does Sweden fit into this picture?
I think you have to use very different metrics for well-developed, largely, almost entirely cash economies. I think you can make valid comparisons between Scandinavian countries. I think you can make comparisons between the U.S. and Canada. You could compare Costa Rica with other Latin American countries. But I think it's a little oversimplification to have a world ranking when there's so much divergence.
In lists of happiness, general well-being of countries, the Scandinavian countries almost consistently are at the top of the list. Denmark is usually right at the top. But those are economies that have a well-developed industrial economies, that have a social welfare ethos in their government. They don't have the ethos that we have, or where we have, whenever you say, we'll take care of all of our people. There's a big strain in American politics that says, oh no you won't, that's for every individual, that's individualism comes out rampant. Even Obama last week at Selma said, we don't believe in equality of outcomes, we only believe in equality of opportunity. Well, a lot of your Scandinavian countries say, we believe in equality of outcomes. We're going to make sure that everybody has the floor of basic social, access to health care, access to decent job, housing under them. That also is enshrined in the latest version of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but the United States has not signed it because of that streak of individualism. So that's part of what goes on when you talk about the industrial country. But the interesting thing about Bhutan is it is not an industrial country, but on some scale, it's just as happy as the Scandinavian countries. But it does that without development. So I think the more profound question is, we assume that these poor third world countries need to become more like us in order for their own well-being. So we send out Peace Corps, we send out development, international development teams to teach them the skills of industrialization on the theory that they're going to be happier if they're like us. But I think this casts significant doubt on the validity of that model.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was so interesting. Michael, I was piqued by your comment about healthcare, that to the right was Western style healthcare, and to the left or whatever was Eastern style. Anybody done any outcome study on which is more successful there? Well, one quick comment. I think they're lucky that the monarchy has been an enlightened one. God forbid if they got someone that lead the country that wasn't. Very interesting. Thank you.
I'm not aware of specific studies. I do know that people respond better to one or to the other. My own grandfather was a missionary in East Africa, and he was the only person within 50 or 100 miles with any Western medications with him, so he was the person to whom people came. But he had an understanding with the local shaman, you probably call him, that there were some people that could benefit more, particularly when it came to mental health issues. from the traditional healing than they could from a bunch of pills that might or might not work.
I may have missed something, but in their
Give us
division
your
of
name.
the, pardon me?
Give us your name.
Oh, my name is Ann Diggs, and in the division of the day into 8, like you mentioned, am I assuming something when I say they all are practicing Buddhists, and that they might spend some of their time in meditation or in some of the practices of Buddhism, which you said there's a list of the way they conduct their lives. I didn't get a feeling about their spiritual part of their lives in either of your talks.
I'm glad you raised that. One of the things that's done in all schools every day is a period of meditation in the morning and again in the afternoon. For small kids, it's probably not all that long, but at least they get that habit. Almost every family traditionally sent a son or occasionally a daughter into the monastery. The monastery used to be the only place for learning, for an education as we know it. And in their questionnaires, they do ask, in a non-intrusive kind of way, do you have time for religious practice every day or every week and things of that nature.
Marilee Cloudson. I think the word happiness is a very difficult word to define whatever process you have in your government and so forth. I don't think it's a word that would cover everything or everybody, because everybody has a different idea of what happiness is. But I think our type of government which strives to allow opportunity to everyone is a very good beginning. And I say beginning because we've never really achieved it. And we are in the process constantly to try to make opportunities equal. And I think once the opportunity to follow your dream is there, that's a form of happiness, which we do this with our schools. We do it with we're striving to do it with our medical profession, which we definitely have not achieved yet. But that's our goal. And I think to call that happiness is too difficult a word.
Thank you.
That is why we try to say well-being any chance we have.
Yeah. Two more.
Brenda Collins, I'm very curious. You mentioned Vermont and Oregon and Maryland. I'm wondering, I assume that they do like an interview questionnaire and they sample, I guess, but I'm wondering what questions they ask. How do they measure happiness in these states?
When I mentioned those states, I used the word adapted rather than adopted. What they've tried to do is to take a whole list of measures which are already available in terms of health at birth, health of young mothers, life expectancy, a whole host of things, and without going to the survey and the detailed kind of questions, that I think it's an awareness that they need to start addressing some of these things. They're very far along. It's really just in the last few years that they've even taken notice of this.
was so interesting. I'm Helen Smith. I'm wondering whether women have equal rights, and the idea of education stopping at the elementary level for most people. Do people who are becoming doctors or lawyers or ministers have further education, and are they relying on technology the way we are?
On elementary education, it's largely a matter of what the country can afford. And they are building secondary schools, they're in the process of building a college. A lot of people go to India for higher education. Our guide actually came to Sydney Hampton in Virginia, and his brother got a master's. Both have worked in this country. The king went to Phillips Academy before going to Wheaton. They're not quite as isolated as you might think.
Women's rights.
Women's rights, very important. Part of a questionnaire that I looked at recently was who in the family owns the property, and the property typically comes down through the female line, and who in the family makes financial decisions, and over 50% are women.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for all your responses. And Michael and Ann will be downstairs at the coffee hour. We can continue this conversation.